Awesome. All right, welcome everyone. We're so glad you were able to join us. We want to have a lively discussion today, and I'm sure that we will. We only have 60 minutes on such a large topic, but we're very happy that you joined us this afternoon. This is an idea that we were thinking about as COVID hit. How can we still engage with the nonprofit community? And you're all dealing with some very heavy issues right now. We want to take up, least amount of time, but still have some rich discussion. So my name is Alicia Schatteman. I'm the director here at the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies at Northern. I'm coming to you from campus today, which is so exciting because we're not on campus very much, so I'm very happy to be here. You'll see Caleb off there. He's our office manager at the center. And Julianne, who's my assistant director. She's also joining us today. And then we have two speakers, and I'll introduce the panelists just in 1 second. So I did want to remind folks that we are recording today. I will make sure that we send the recording out to you after. Oopsie. And I will send probably with an evaluation notice as well. And it'll come probably around 2:30 if I can get this all finished in time. The Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies is an interdisciplinary center. We're housed in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, but our staff and our faculty, they come from across the university. And our center is a little bit different, I would say, by many other kind of nonprofit programs that are out there. We're interdisciplinary, so our students take courses across the university, but we also kind of balance that why we need things like civic engagement and activism with the more practical knowledge-based technical skills like fundraising. So that's the kind of niche kind of that we're in as a program. We have an undergraduate program in nonprofit and NGO studies, and then we work with our MPA program here for folks that are interested in graduate school. So our two panelists this morning, they were invited to join me because of their background and history and really all of their experience in the sector. Dr. Yvonne Harrison, who has experience in governance and leadership of the nonprofit and voluntary sector organizations, both in the United States as well as Canada, where she's joining us from this morning. She and her co-investigator, Professor Vic Murray, developed the board checkup, and it's boardcheckup.com. If you're interested, you can go there and do an assessment of your board, lots of free resources. It's an open access material, so I would definitely suggest you check that out. She's done a lot of open online courses, MOOCs on leadership and governance of nonprofit organizations to kind of fill that gap in nonprofit leadership education and build the capacity of nonprofit boards. She's currently affiliated faculty with the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria and the School of Social Work at the University at Buffalo, SUNY. Shawn Jeffers is also joining us from his boardroom this morning. You can see Shawn up there. Shawn has over 35 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. He currently serves as the executive director of Little City Foundation in Palatine, Illinois, which he's done for nearly 18 years. He's also served on many nonprofit boards, including Aurora University, where he earned his bachelor's degree, and he earned his MPA from us, from NIU, and now also teaches in the program, most notably about leadership and government in the nonprofit sector. So why we set up this series and why we think these discussions are needed right now, it's really a critical point for nonprofits that are grappling with COVID-19 and the governance issues that it has highlighted, that maybe it has challenged, certainly brought to light. A lot of those things maybe are assumptions of how organizations should work during a crisis. So we've been really faced to have some really difficult conversations. And at the same time, we know some organizations, especially human services and food organizations, are experiencing increasing demand for services, and yet others remained under complete shutdown, especially organizations like arts and culture. So nonprofit organizations are grappling with those very serious decisions that are affecting not only their staff and volunteers and the people that they serve, and really thinking about the long-term impact on the organization and communities, what those communities will look like, who they're able to serve, and how. So that weight of governance is heavy, and board members may not feel prepared to make some of those decisions, especially around these time-sensitive conditions where you don't have the time to really think through all the possible scenarios. You must act. And you must lead. And so that's kind of our framing our discussion this morning. We sent out a brief survey. So for those of you who were able to participate in that, we got some answers, and I know our panelists, they're going to touch on some of those things as we go through the session. But certainly some of the highlights were definitely around the immediate issues of funding, fundraising, but also funding. and just the challenges of not being able to hold things in person, whether that's program service delivery, but also just meetings in general, and thinking about what's the long-term impact. Certainly there's some short-term decisions that need to be made, but then longer term, what are our challenges? So when you think about the governing challenges that some of you mentioned in there, was a really also prioritizing what needs to be done, how quickly that needs to be done. Who do you engage with? All of the various stakeholders, including governing bodies in the outside of your organization, local, state, as well as federal. And I think advocacy will definitely play a bigger role than maybe it has by boards kind of moving forward. And then lots around donors. We saw rapid response from our regional donors, state donors, some really quickly pooling funds, but those are going to run out. So then what's next after those, kind of the lifeline for some of those response funders happen. And it has redirected funding, both from individuals as well as traditional donors towards COVID, whereas other organizations, they're also facing some shortages because they would have traditionally been able to fundraise from those donors. So those are kind of some of the big governing issues. And what we had planned to do today is really have Shawn kind of kick off kind of around 3 themes. And then Yvonne will come in and talk about those. So our 3 themes that we're going to start with are really the values of nonprofits. What are the values of the organizations? Thinking through that. What is disruption and fear? What does he see? How boards are responding to that? And then things around mission and networks. So Shawn, I'll turn it over to you. We'll try to keep it to 5 to 7 minutes each, and then we'll go through our next themes. So how does that sound, Shawn?
Sounds good. And you, by all means, cut me off. And, I definitely want to just put this in the right context. And I often say, if you've seen one nonprofit, nothing that I say, do I want to be perceived that we're monolithic, that we're somehow a one-size-fits-all. And I can speak to you from at least the ground floor of a large nonprofit organization that has wrestled with this in a very deep and personal way, because we are a human service entity, and there was no way that we could all shelter in place. For our organization, there's a matter of fact, I was sharing with Yvonne and Alicia that last night we celebrated our annual meeting. And it was a rather unusual annual meeting because, one, we weren't in the room together. It was done virtually. A lot of the exchanges that we ordinarily would make could not occur. We were actually inducting one new member into our board emeritus, and we were also witnessing the transition of one of our board president, who's stepping away, and the incoming board president coming in. But it also provided us with just a time of reflection and spoke to the notion of values. There's a number of different themes that have emerged. One is that we're in an unprecedented period. All the things that we used to call upon to solve problems and address issues, many of those strategies are gone. And so what we began to talk about is more from an organizational life cycle and alignment, that we're asking ourselves, are we the right leaders for this moment within our organization? And I think that's something we all have to ask at a personal level. As I'm a person who's nearing kind of end of career in terms of this phase, I had to ask myself, given what lies ahead, am I the right person to lead this organization? I've had that conversation very candidly with my board as we begin to assess what it's going to take. My board is also asking itself, because if we believe in org life cycles and we believe in alignment, we're not cut out to do that which is ahead of us to do. If you brought folks in who were very prolific and strong fundraisers, and they're now in an environment where resources are declining, their skill set may not match. If you brought in people who aren't really into strategy and planning, and now we're at a point where strategy and planning is not optional, it's crucial. So assessing at a board level, do we have the right people and the right tools to do that which lies ahead, I think is going to be a very fundamental challenge. For us as a nonprofit, I had to laugh because some of my early public administration experiences have become real. I made it akin to, we're required to learn CPR, but I pray each day that I never have to use it. So it's something I'm glad I know, but I never want to use it. Some of the tools that we learned in public administration, such as that term, which I never quite understood at that moment, satisficing. You know, how do you come up with these range of options of which none of them are the best, but you got to pick. So for us, for example, we serve 1,100 people who come to and from our day program service. We had to make some decisions because I can no longer serve 1,100 people in the way that we once did. And so I'm discussing that with my board on, given that transportation has been cut by 2/3. I can't bring 8 people in a van that I used to. I got to cut that down to 2. Which people will actually get served and how? And so we began to look at that none of these are desired options, but they are options that are going to be required in order for us to be sustained. And I think that's very tough for a board that was built on growth and movement to now talk about how can we get small enough to be big enough to survive in I think the oncoming future. So the disruption has brought about some creativity, but it's brought about fear. And I know Yvonne will get into this. Our boards, when we usually select them, we select them for their business, their knowledge, and the like. But they're being impacted in a very similar way as organizations are. You know, I've got board members who are at the brink of losing their employment. I got board members whose families have been totally. One or more of the members of the family has to stay back and help teach the kids since we're all in the e-learning. And so this disruption is not only within our sector, but it's cutting across the personal lives of our board members. I know with organizations, there are board members who have left. I've had a couple people who have left because the magnitude of this, you know, coupled with their own life struggles, makes board service an even struggle. I've got board members who are now reaching out to us for help by way of both our networks and the people that we know and the things that we do. So I do think that all the things that we were taught as public leaders are now coming to fruition. Those contingency plans that we once put off to the side are now becoming realities. And so the challenge among us now is, you know, we're mentioning that we want to come out of this better and not bitter. And that becomes kind of that strategy. So Alicia, I'm going to pause for a moment and hopefully come back to some of the things that we've done in recognizing the challenges that lies ahead.
Thank you, Shawn. Yvonne? Oh, you have to unmute. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Shawn, for that. And I'm going to just kind of step back and draw from the research and draw from governance theory and point out, and I like how you talked about new tools, right? That are required now, that have always been available, that we've never really turned to because the environment perhaps didn't call for that. And we are experiencing one of the greatest governance issues of our lifetimes with the pandemic. And what Chait, Ryan, and Taylor would call a landmark governance issue and an opportunity for a generative governance conversation. And so I want to highlight Governance as Leadership, which is their book published by BoardSource. And really this becomes an opportunity then to set aside, as Shawn was saying, the day-to-day and really put these larger questions that he raised, such as, are we the right leaders for this time? Do we have all that we need in terms of the composition or leadership of our board to address the issues before us? But even before that, what I heard Shawn saying, and which is emphasized in terms of a generative governance, is, do we have the data? Do we understand what the issues before us? And research coming out of well, your own little survey last night that Alicia, all of you are experiencing different things. Research coming out of Imagine Canada is going to say not all responses to the pandemic have been the same. For some charities and not-for-profits, there's been an increase in demand for services. For others, there have been a decline in demand for services. and so on. So there's going to be a need for examining these issues, gathering data about them, understanding them, and governing them before any kind of strategies or solutions are decided. And so that's what I hear Shawn talking about, is really facilitating that kind of generative governance and doing it within the context of his organization. And not all are the same, and it's going to depend on the type, the size, the mission of your organization, why it exists, and so on. The other point to be made is that this isn't all externally focused, as Shawn has pointed out. Your own board members, your own staff, the people you serve, you're all affected by the pandemic. And so your focus can't just be external, it has to be internal. And that makes us a very complex set of challenges here. And how do you meet the demands for care and support and services inside and outside when you're strapped for resources? You have to lay off staff. And you know, at the governing table, you have serious issues facing, and yet your board members are dealing with their own uncertainties in their own professional and personal lives. So I'll just stop there.
Awesome. So our next big themes that we saw, you know, underscored in the survey that we did and that we've had discussions about is obviously financial health is top of mind when it comes to the pandemic, but not just in the short term, but long term. So that's one of our key themes. And then I'd like to bring in that discussion of how are nonprofits using their governing documents, those critical things, your organization policies and procedures that help your organization run, and then bringing that notion of people back into this discussion. So those are the three themes that we'll talk about next. Shawn, do you want to go first?
And I think, you know, one of the joys in working with Yvonne is she definitely, you know, triggers some ideas and thoughts. And one of the things that we had to recognize, and I think all of us on this call, is that it's not over yet. And, you know, have we seen the worst of what's going to happen as a result? And we're unsure, we're uncertain. And so I think that uncertainty really makes us take a very close look at the logic behind what we do. You know, we've made it, again, I think each is akin to is an aftershock. We know what COVID initially did, but we're only just to see as you walk out the degree of destruction and the weakened infrastructures that it brought about, whether or not that's the untimely exit of key people within an organization. I've actually had some senior leaders who said, this is the time, you know, I'm going to cash out and move on. We've seen that governmentally, we've seen it in a number of different ways. And so I think that uncertainty, Alicia, makes it very difficult to say that we have the right things documented and written for a future that we're very much uncertain about. You know, and going back to my board members and not only board members, I would recruit board members on the basis of this idea that we were going to be the best and we're going to grow. How true is that now? I have board members who say, Shawn, if you can't be the best at it, get out of it, because that's their mindset. You know, if you can't run the business exceptionally well to be the best, divest and go to something else. We're at a point where with constrained resources, really, I mean, we've got resource availability being very much constrained, but need is unlimited. On how do you begin to make decisions that meet a greater good, but doesn't necessarily position you to be the best? I mean, that's a tough issue. So now my draw to board members is come help me do what no one thought we can do. even if we're not the best at it, you know, we're going to at least try and get it done. It's moving people from this be a champion to now be, to some extent, a savior. Because we already recognize that this ability to do it exceptionally well is very much constrained by this moment and also not knowing. And so I think that reality is going to be very tough for us to put our arms around and really grapple with. To my donors, you know, once again, no one likes to give to a sinking ship. I'm sorry. You know, no one wants to give to a black hole, you know, and going back to them and at least trying to present this idea that we have a good handle on a future. It's been very positive messaging because the gloom and doom, and they're faced with that too. Some of my donors, their portfolios are being hit in an equal way. And so our messaging has had to become a lot stronger about the immediate benefit of what they do. And so we're making use of these platforms like you have now. I have my first virtual town hall shortly after the announcement of the closing of within programs within the state by the governor. We are reaching more people and have to do it quicker, but also giving them some sense that there's progress. The messaging, Alicia, is becoming exceptionally critical.
Yvonne?
Okay, there's a couple of points here I wanted to emphasize, and I'm going to draw some data from our own research on issues that challenge boards from their own perspective. So this is, as Alicia mentioned, the board checkup. Over 10,000 board members have taken it, or people who interact with boards. And what I did was separate since COVID, what issues were challenging boards, and I took a look at them. And a number of issues were coming up around board member engagement, and for those having difficulty getting engaged and being unclear about what their role and responsibilities are within this new environment. Needing to be reminded and needing to be developed around those roles and responsibilities, and also what their legal liabilities are. So there's a lot of risk here in this new environment when you can't guarantee the best. And I saw a comment about, well, what is the best? And that goes back to effectiveness criteria for the organization, and particularly the values that it has in it. Organization theory tells us there are different sets of criteria. And in not-for-profit organizations, often where differences or tensions can lie is in people placing more value on one set of criteria over another. And in this environment, I would say more tension will result because they're going to shift. All right, so where we all used to use this set of indicators, as Shawn was kind of alluding to, is the best. Now that shifted, we need another set of indicators. It's not either or, they're both important, and that adds an additional complexity because you're going to be managing for effectiveness from different dimensions, and that can introduce paradox. So when we try to do one thing, something else happens in the organization. And I think Shawn bringing up the point about success is really important here, because we may fail, right? But we have to try. And so having working hypotheses about and aligning our strategy, making it evidence-based, choosing options with the best information that we have at the time, having hypotheses about these data we will check, and making sure that that our decisions are backed and tracked. And so I think that's where you set yourself up for learning and growing in this time, as Shawn said, that we don't have any real experience with this change on a dime, and adapting and trying new things, or deciding that we're not sustainable, and how do we move? That's a large governance issue, perhaps the biggest one. Where do we go from here externally? So board members have a lot of needs around it and a lot of fear if they're staying. I would say the skill set has shifted, and perhaps recruiting from the for-profit world may help you, where they're very steeped in problems, they're very steeped in strategies, they're very steeped in evidence to support investment, particularly of scarce resources, in a new strategy that they think may return value to the organization. So I would say that recruitment, board composition, recruitment, but even on top of that, you're going to be scrutinized for your recruitment to make sure that it's diverse and representative of the communities you serve, and people will be watching you. It was nice to hear that Shawn's organization has a very first in 61 years female board chair. Those are the kinds of decisions that you're going to make, and those are the things that are going to be scrutinized. So there's going to be added complexity just because of the environment that we're also in around systemic racism and discrimination. And you're going to also need to evaluate, it's not good enough to have policies. Your procedures must align with those policies, and at every level. So from your job descriptions to your recruitment strategies to your selection processes. So, and then on terms of finance, again, I think this calls for, aligning your resources with your strategy, performance-based budgeting. Finally, we've been talking about this for so long. And now the case has to be made to align those resources with your priorities, and then to keep that really nice and tightly focused. I think because there are these constraints, that might be easier to do now than it was before, when resources were abundant and so were strategies, and maybe priorities weren't so clear. So I'll just stop right there.
Before we move on to our next kind of group of themes, I wanted you both to kind of comment on those critical governance documents, and maybe Shawn, from your perspective, what did your board, when some of these decisions had to be made, did they turn to those documents? How useful were they? Or is that kind of a common practice? And then Yvonne, you can chime in. Shawn?
Well, Alicia, I think it's been escalated, particularly being a large nonprofit. We have a number of different partners. The first group to call me and my board was our bank, because they needed to get an understanding of how this is playing out. Lines of credit, bonds that are due, et cetera. So they're concerned on the future kind of viability. And so our investment practices, we were in a very aggressive market. We have an investment committee that we had to re-look at those things. We had to look at liquidity. We had to look at, I think, fortunate in this state that the governor did almost do a hold harmless. He let us keep our doors open with state dollars coming in, even though people weren't being served. And so we had to make sure that the financial practices of the organization were safe. Human resource practices, we've got, that's been challenged right now by way of who stays home and who has to come to work. There's some concern too, that where the board's very concerned, we had to take a look at our liability coverage. They're concerned about their vulnerability in this new environment by way of the decisions that they make or don't make. And so, as we know, we're in a very litigious kind of society right now. And so that discussion is taking place on, do we have people sign waivers before they come on, or cut off the volunteers? And so all of those governance practices have had to be re-examined in the context of this COVID environment. Some adjustments made, but sustainability has really been the key on we're just kind of running that risk. So we've got a 90-day kind of plan that I have to come back to the board after those 90 days and discuss moving 90 days ahead what we expect to occur, because we knew during this pandemic, we're going to have a period of decline. Resources aren't coming in. Just on from March to June was the peak of our special event period. We lost a net of $1 million. And that, we're not going to recover that. And so understanding that those dollars were going to go for, we had given out pay increases in December on the anticipation of a very bright spring. So the board, particularly our finance committee, wanted me to come in and show how can I sustain that. So sustainability has really been, I think, the mirror by which we have to look at all of our practices.
Thank you. Yvonne?
Yeah, I'm going to draw some stats because they relate to what Shawn's talking about funding. So in Canada, this is a survey of Canadian charities. Earned income, 31% of charities report a decline since the pandemic. 70% experience a decline in revenues. Donations are down 75%. And investment income is down 25%. So you can just imagine, the impact that finance has on the organization and the decisions that Shawn's talking about. And thank goodness, this is when we need our governments who can step in, and the Canadian government has done so, just like your state government, in terms of offering wage subsidies. So that's another thing that nonprofits need to be, and boards need to be aware of. What are the grants and funding opportunities from the government? But in response to your question about the governing documents, one, so there's the, a board has a set of governing documents. The bylaws are the rules in which specify how the board operates, how it makes decisions. Do you have quorum to make those decisions? So they're very important. Everyone, I had to go into a couple of boards and share those bylaws, and we talked about those. And then we also talked about our duties and the duties of directors in terms of their own legal duties in the governance process around the duty of care, to be informed, the duty of due diligence, to engage and participate and to give voice to issues within the governance process before a decision is made, and then loyalty around that decision. And so I spent a lot of time talking about the importance of being informed. And some of the issues that come out of our research is that board members are saying they're not getting their agendas enough ahead of time, or the information in enough time to really read them, to really ask the tough questions or the questions that they feel need to be asked before a decision is made. So that's challenging their own duties as directors, but also then to give voice to them, that they really have to before the decision is made, not after. And I have found when you discuss the rules at which the board operates and the duties of directors within that those rules, there's much more clarity, and I've seen much more robust discussion and comfort. Everyone kind of feels a relief that they can speak freely, and they have this opportunity. And this is where public administration again comes in handy around. You either you need to give voice, and that's your public service kind of value there to do that, and also within the rules of the board. So those bylaws, again, they may need to be updated, and many boards may find that they are out of date. And so there may need to be some changes there. I don't know whether, Shawn, you might talk about, your own governing documents, and whether you needed to refer to those at all.
Yeah, one of the things that I think you just brought about another thought, our governance, particularly membership criteria, has changed. We are a give-get organization, meaning that there's a minimum expectation of each board member relative to not only their personal gift, but their funds raised through their networks. And we examine that because this organization had a very rich history with some very prominent Chicago-based citizens that had abilities to write huge checks at any given moment. Well, that's changed. And so our board had to look at that, particularly if we're going to address matters of diversity, matters of representation. Those member expectations really geared itself. And so we're wrestling with that because our fundraising platforms was built around the notion of those people and their friends. And so our board has modified the membership criteria, recognizing that it's going to mean that we're going to have to do more grassroots related fundraising to make up for that loss. But they do believe that it will bring a different level of engagement within the boardroom itself. So that was a huge jump for us. And I think it did open the door for different members to come on who are bringing some skills beyond their ability just to write checks. That's still vitally important, but we have to come up with another way to begin to touch those publics as opposed to having the corporate leaders sitting in the room who are capable of bailing you out financially. Right now, Yvonne, their companies are struggling. The whole notion of corporate giving is flipping around. So we're just at this place that that degree of uncertainty is definitely and the fears that they have from personal litigation. If we make a wrong decision, what's going to happen?
Just to touch on, you've changed your expectations, but also your membership criteria, which is great. Some of the issues coming out from our research are around, so when you do that, what around your meetings, or oftentimes some of the issues, and these are the top issues coming out since COVID around board members, is around discussion. That sometimes the discussion is dominated by a few board members. And how do those newer board members feel, and how is that facilitated? Or maybe the board is structured with an executive committee, and that's going to be laid out in your bylaws. And maybe a lot of the decision making or information is shared there, and it's not filtering out to the rest of the board. Those are just some of the issues that we're hearing, so, and that really need to be addressed so that all board members, and not just, you know, especially when you diversify your composition, can contribute equally in giving voice to having the information at the same time. And maybe that places more emphasis on the chair to facilitate a discussion where all can contribute.
Thank you. So when we had an initial discussion, we knew that we were going to lay out all these challenges and that people were going to be like, oh, this is hard. And so we thought, well, let's talk about some things, how we can move forward and leave you with some hopefulness that organizations will be able to sustain themselves, will be able to provide services to their communities, because those problems are still out there. If not, they're growing even in some cases. So two themes that we talked about were around technology, and then thinking about how are you in this not able to plan, to Shawn's words, not able to plan much beyond 90 days. How do you plan in that environment? So Shawn, if you want to talk about those two, technology and then trying to think about beyond the next 90 days.
Well, I think one of the, and it came up, I believe, in a comment that Yvonne had made earlier, you got to be honest about the data in front of you. You know, I jokingly would, when we recruit board members, I'd say, please don't leave your brains in the parking lot when you walk in. Oftentimes people sit on nonprofit boards basically illiterate to the finances of that organization. Now, that's not the only thing, the missions, and no mission, no margin, no marginal mission, but that becomes vitally important. The data tells you a lot. We have invested very heavily in not only our dashboards, but just our overall accounting of because we're chasing all kinds of money, PPP, grants, you name it. I mean, there are, anywhere someone any dollars, we're running after. But keeping in track and knowing how permanent or impermanent those things are becomes vitally important. So I think right now, Alicia, vitally important that people understand, much as you and I go in for physical exam, your numbers matter. That A1C, all those things that are in front of you matter because they're going to tell you a lot about your future. And so understanding cash flow, understanding volatility, because if we're going to sit down, because the other thing that didn't come up on the survey, which we had a very successful merger 3 years ago. And that merger came about because two boards saw the reality facing each organization. And that whole notion of 1 + 1 = 3 came about. I'm surprised by the absence of discussion around the idea of how do we come together given our current situation and become stronger from that. Everyone right now, at least in our space, is looking at how can they win this alliance. You're going to see the data's there that a number of those, particularly smaller organizations, are going to fail. No longer a merger option because you're coming in with tremendous debt. So I hope that the boards are understanding and their financial literacy has to improve, particularly given what we're faced with right now.
I think technology can help improve that literacy. And, first I want to emphasize that in COVID has really highlighted the need for data and science and expertise, technical expertise to deal with some of these very, very, what Ryan and Taylor would call landmark governance issues where there's no clear right or wrong answer. But they could be irreversible. And so they become so important. A lot of technologies have existed for a long time. I've been writing about technology for the last 20 years and writing about these performance frameworks, systems, thinking about your organization from an enterprise-wide view. Don't pick and choose apps. Think about, technology kind of from an enterprise-wide and, align your values with your indicators and implement systems that you can track how well you're doing and generate user-friendly reports that anybody can understand. And so that sounds pretty simple, but actually it's fairly complex because you need to govern technology and boards need to place value on those decisions and need to think about them more in terms of not just can we have this or access it or not, how do we use it and support it in ways where the data generated from it is used. And so not all systems or applications are the same. It's more than technology, it's about supporting the implementation of that technology and procuring those contracts. I have seen nonprofits procure very bad technology contracts and get stuck with vendors and not get what they really need. And so technology really needs to be governed at the board level. Is there that capability there to think strategically about it and to help again allocate enough resources so that it can be used effectively. The good news is that the costs aren't that high anymore to rent, from the cloud, a system like this. You don't have to purchase it yourself anymore. But so technology is going to have, and if you haven't thought about it before, you certainly must think about it now. And that's just going to add a whole other level of complexity to the issues that are facing your board. But again, it's something that you're going to need to address. So I'll just kind of stop there. Oh, you're muted, Alicia.
Thinking about your path forward, Shawn, at your organization, there's certain things you had to make, decisions you had to make right away. If you think going forward, what are some things that you're really going to change how you do things, what services you provide to whom? What do you think are going to be some lasting effects coming out of this? And maybe
Well,
some
I think one, very clearly, we were heavily invested in office space. We had a big footprint. You know, a few years ago, bought the building that we're sitting in right now with the idea of particularly purchasing more and moving a number of our operations this direction. Our footprint is going to get smaller. We recognize that people can successfully work from home in some ways that, you know, we've often talked about, but it became a reality. So I doubt right now this building I'm in is only 1/3 occupied, and I don't see it necessarily growing much beyond that. We also got lucky on some IT purchases. We're using the desktop as a service. A lot of our stuff went to the cloud, so people can work from home far more effectively. Our board meeting has proven that I've had greater attendance and participation virtually than I did in trying to corral them during a lunch or dinner to travel from their offices to a central location. And now we've just got to figure out how we can make that more effective. It's also been a challenge. You can have the tools, but if you don't invest in the training for the people to use the tools. So we've had to invest a lot. You know, most people know how to click on Teams or Zoom, but they don't know how to move in terms of creating a room or putting together a poll, et cetera. So the IT training, at least technology training, is going to become very crucial. With the individuals we serve, we now have been approved for virtual day services. We're doing some things where people don't have to get on a bus and travel to a location, that service can come to them. We're seeing telehealth is changing things. Never thought that would be an option. Now it's preferred by some. Instead of going into a doctor's office and the like, to have the ability to bring the care into the home and develop the staff. So we're beginning to see that technology in a number of places, but there's some resistance on the level of staff and people to have that technology be their new normal. And so I don't see, Alicia, us going back to that old way of doing things.
Yeah, and I think, you know, technology is also going to be not just for performance, but programming as well. And, you know, coming out of the Imagine Canada survey, that some organizations are having difficulty transitioning their programs to the online environment, and having to decide whether they can be or not, you know, depending on what they are. And you know, so technology is going to touch all aspects from governance to operations, and shift us. And, you know, I did my dissertation research on the adoption of modern information and communication technology and volunteerism, both from supply, from the volunteers who use it, and demand perspectives, those programs. And again, there are certain factors associated with whether the adoption will be successful or not, and those tools used to the extent to which you expect them to be used. And so yes, there needs to be training and development, but they need also to be introduced in ways where the success increases. So for example, the people who have, and this is from the research, been doing their way of business more than 5 years are less likely to want to change how they do their work. So choosing people who are newer actually to the profession or newer in the role maybe, and who have more experience using these tools, maybe not in that context, maybe in a related, may help influence the adoption and the experience that those around them have with technology. So giving careful thought past the purchase and the support to the introduction and implementation of those tools within the work environment, kind of creating champions of change, and using volunteers to and staff with experience to be leaders of this, and to help the organization change in this way.
So Yvonne, you bring up the human dimension, and these are organizations that exist on paper but are all people-based.
Yeah.
How do we kind of support these organizations and these boards to build that culture of caring and compassion going forward when it's a time when those things are being stressed and everybody's overwhelmed?
Well, I think, you know, the human element doesn't have to change just because you're using a tool. And so to build in and think about, you know, from technology from a social, technical perspective. And so emphasizing human relations and considerate leadership around that, trying to build in more opportunities for interaction. I love how Shawn said that he's had his attendance is higher. So if you engage your members in human-centered ways, provide lots of opportunity. And in fact, because you are having your meetings online, you actually have to plan for them. Maybe you've already noticed that, Shawn. You're maybe spending more time planning that meeting than you did before, but I doubt that because you're probably really busy. It takes up a lot of your time. But to think about how people are going to engage socially online maybe is coming top of mind then in planning those meetings. Those are the kinds of things that you can't lose. And I think when you do that, when you make them human-centered and you put that lens on it, then you're more likely than people to feel satisfied, be heard, and all of those kind of behaviors and relationships that you're looking to build.
So Shawn, how are you guys doing that?
Just a recent experience that, you know, some may look at as somewhat, how can I put it, extravagant, but in preparation for our annual meeting, my development team purchased some wine glasses that were etched with the Little City logo, and they were delivered to each board member's home or office with a bottle of wine. To get the bottle of wine, my events got canceled, and my wine vendor had wine to give me, so it wasn't. So each board member got 2 glasses and bottle of wine along with a card, you know, thanking them for service and the like. And yesterday's meeting ended with opening of that wine and sharing a toast. The feedback that I got from our board members, from just someone pulling up and ringing their doorbell and saying here, and just that presence. One of my banker board members said, Shawn, business was always thought of giving nonprofits ideas, but you've given me one because I haven't reached out to my customers during COVID. So that little exchange, Alicia, moved the needle by way of them recognizing that we see them during this time. And the result from that, from the enthusiasm and the connection. So I do think we've got to find those ways to serve and get served. And so just finding that mutuality in some, it's not just the sacrifice of coming into a boardroom, but how do we extend ourselves in a way to help them feel more connected in moments that they've been pushed out. So I've been just very pleased with the feedback. You know, it was well worth that investment to give them that touch, that little token of appreciation. And I have no doubt that the return from that is going to be tremendous.
That's a great example, Shawn. Well, it's hard to believe we have literally talked for almost an hour. There's so much more that we could talk about, but any final closing marks before people need to move on to the rest of their day? Yvonne, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I think, you know, around board culture. So we're kind of talking about culture of how to use technology and you know, to think about that and not to forget that, even though you're at a distance from each other. And I was so in a conversation we had with Shawn, and the emphasis that Shawn places on culture, and the value on those engaged in terms of leadership, that those are the, you know, those are some issues that we also study and have such an impact. They're difficult, culture is difficult to change, but maybe now is a time, and I've seen a lot of that, where people really are supporting each other far more than perhaps they did before. And maybe this is time for a cultural shift, and to get closer, you know, to start out with where we, to the values that we hold so dear, right, as in the sector and in our own organizations and in our own lives.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Well, I want to thank both Shawn and Yvonne for coming in and sharing their wealth of experience. As I said, we will send out a recording and an evaluation. And these conversations where we're bringing together academic researchers with people that are working in the field are so important to bring those worlds together, to learn from each other as we get through this COVID. So next up, we will have equity and inclusion in October. It should be a great session. And the whole issue of philanthropy will be coming up in November. So I really hope all of you are here on the call can join us for that next issue. And I want to thank our panelists, so we can virtually give them a hand.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.